The morning sun painted the Montana prairie in gold and orange as Jake Winters guided his old pickup truck down the dusty ranch road. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white from years of hard work under the open sky. At 58, Jake had spent most of his life on this land, watching seasons change and cattle roam the endless grasslands that stretched to the horizon. The radio crackled with morning news, but Jake barely listened. His mind was heavy with worry about the ranch's finances. The bank letter sitting on his kitchen table had made it clear 3 months behind on the mortgage meant serious trouble. The drought last year had killed most of his crops, and cattle prices had dropped so low that selling his herd barely covered the feed costs. Jake pulled the truck to a stop near the old water tank where his cattle usually gathered for their morning drink. As he stepped out, his boots crunched on the dry grass. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the familiar scent of sage and prairie wind that he had loved since childhood. But today, even the beauty of the land couldn't lift his spirits. He walked toward the fence line, checking the posts and wire for any breaks or damage. This daily routine had become almost automatic over the years. His father had taught him to walk the property every morning, looking for problems before they became disasters. A good rancher knows every inch of his land, his father used to say. Jake could still hear those words in his mind, spoken in the deep voice of a man who had worked this same earth until the day he died. As Jake rounded a small hill covered with buffalo grass, something unusual caught his eye. About 200 yards away, near the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his property, stood a group of buffalo. This wasn't completely strange. Wild buffalo sometimes wandered onto ranch land from the nearby national preserve. What made Jake stop and stare was the buffalo standing in the center of the group. It was completely white. Jake had heard stories about white buffalo from his grandfather, who had been part Lakota. According to the old man's tales, a white buffalo was sacred, a sign of great spiritual power and change. His grandfather had died when Jake was only 12, but the stories had stayed with him through all these years. Now, seeing one with his own eyes, Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The white buffalo was magnificent. It stood taller than the others, its pure white coat gleaming like fresh snow in the morning sunlight. Its massive head was crowned with curved horns that looked like polished ivory. The animal's dark eyes seemed intelligent and calm as it gazed across the prairie. Around it, about 20 other buffalo grazed peacefully, their dark brown coats making the white one stand out even more dramatically. Jake reached into his truck and pulled out his binoculars for a closer look. Through the lenses, he could see every detail of the rare animal. Its coat was not just white, but seemed to glow with an inner light. There were no patches of brown or gray. It was perfectly, completely white from nose to tail. For several minutes, Jake watched the herd through his binoculars. The buffalo moved slowly across his pasture, eating the grass and drinking from the creek. The white one seemed to be the leader, with the others following its movements. When it lifted its head to look around, the entire herd would stop and listen. When it moved to a new grazing spot, they all followed. Jake knew he should probably call the wildlife authorities. Buffalo weren't supposed to wander freely on private ranch land, and there could be legal issues if one of them got hurt or caused damage. But something stopped him from reaching for his phone. Watching these magnificent animals, especially the white one, filled him with a sense of wonder he hadn't felt in years. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in the wind. The white buffalo brings change, boy. When you see one, your life will never be the same. As the morning wore on, Jake found himself unable to leave. He sat on his truck's tailgate, watching the herd through his binoculars and thinking about his grandfather's stories. According to Lakota legend, the white buffalo was sacred to White Buffalo Calf Woman, a holy figure who had brought the sacred pipe to the people. Seeing a white buffalo was considered a blessing that could bring peace, harmony, and spiritual renewal. Jake wasn't a particularly religious man, but growing up with his grandfather's influence had left him with a deep respect for Native American spiritual beliefs. He had always felt a connection to the land that went beyond simple ownership. This prairie wasn't just property to him. It was home, heritage, and identity all rolled into one. Around noon, the buffalo began moving toward the eastern edge of his property. Jake followed at a distance in his truck, careful not to get too close and spook them. The white buffalo led the way, moving with a dignified grace that seemed almost human in its intelligence. As they approached the fence line that separated Jake's ranch from the National Preserve, Jake faced a decision that would change everything. The fence was old and had several gaps that needed repair. The buffalo could easily push through or step over the lower sections. Most ranchers would have honked their horn or fired a warning shot to drive the animals away from their property as quickly as possible. But Jake found himself thinking about something different. These buffalo, especially the white one, represented something pure and wild that was becoming rare in the modern world. They belonged to this land just as much as his cattle did, maybe more. His grandfather would have called them relatives, part of the great circle of life that included all living things. Instead of driving them away, Jake did something that surprised even himself. He got out his truck and walked to the fence line. Using wire cutters from his toolbox, he began cutting through the old fence to create a wider opening. The work was hard and made his back ache, but he kept going until there was a gap wide enough for the entire herd to pass through safely. The white buffalo watched him work from about 50 yards away. Its dark eyes seemed to study Jake's every movement, as if trying to understand his intentions. When Jake finished cutting the fence and stepped back, the magnificent animal approached slowly. It stopped just a few feet from the fence line and looked directly at Jake. For a moment that seemed to last forever, man and buffalo stared at each other across the space that separated their worlds. Jake felt as if the animal was trying to communicate something important, some message that went beyond words or normal understanding. The buffalo's eyes were deep and wise, like those of an ancient spirit that had seen the prairie when it was young and wild. Then, with what Jake could only describe as dignity, the white buffalo nodded its great head once and turned to lead its herd through the opening. One by one, the other buffalo followed, passing through the gap Jake had created and moving onto the preserve land where they would be safe and protected. The last buffalo in line was an old cow with a calf at her side. As she passed through the fence, she stopped and looked back at Jake. Her eyes held the same intelligence and gratitude that Jake had seen in the white buffalo's gaze. Then, she and her calf hurried to catch up with the rest of the herd. Jake stood by the fence for a long time after the buffalo disappeared into the preserve. The prairie seemed empty without them, and he found himself missing their presence already. He had just made a decision that could cause him problems with his neighbors, the wildlife authorities, and maybe even the bank. Damaging fence lines and allowing wild animals onto his property went against everything he had been taught about modern ranching. But somehow, he felt better than he had in months. That evening, Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and purple. The bank letter still sat on his kitchen table, and the mortgage was still 3 months behind. The drought damage to his pastures was still visible, and cattle prices hadn't magically improved. All his practical problems remained exactly the same. Yet something had changed. The feeling of hopelessness that had been weighing him down for months seemed lighter somehow. Seeing the white buffalo and making the choice to help rather than hinder had reminded him of something important about who he was and what this land meant to him. His grandfather had always taught him that the prairie was alive, that it had a spirit and a memory that connected all things. Today, Jake had felt that connection again for the first time in years. The white buffalo had brought him something he didn't even realize he had lost, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake made a decision. He would find a way to save the ranch, not just for himself, but for the buffalo and all the wild things that called this prairie home. He didn't know how yet, but he felt certain that today's encounter was just the beginning of something larger. The white buffalo had brought change, just as his grandfather's stories had promised. Now Jake had to be worthy of whatever that change might bring. In the distance, carried by the evening wind, he thought he heard the sound of buffalo calling to each other across the preserve. The white one was out there somewhere, leading its herd under the same stars that had watched over this land for thousands of years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Jake felt hopeful for the first time in a very long while. The sacred buffalo had crossed his land and touched his life. According to his grandfather's stories, that meant his greatest test and his greatest blessing were both yet to come. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's encounter with the white buffalo, and life had taken an unexpected turn. Word of the sacred animal's appearance had spread through the local Native American community faster than prairie fire. Jake first learned about this when Thomas Crow Feather, an elder from the nearby Blackfeet Reservation, appeared at his door on a Tuesday morning. Thomas was a man in his 70s with long gray braids and deep lines carved into his face by decades of sun and wind. He wore traditional clothing, a leather vest decorated with intricate beadwork over a simple cotton shirt, and turquoise jewelry that caught the morning light. When Jake opened his door, Thomas stood quietly on the porch, holding a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. "Mr. Winters," Thomas said in a voice that carried the weight of years and wisdom, "I am Thomas Crowfeather. I have come to talk with you about the sacred white buffalo that crossed your land." Jake invited the elder inside and offered him coffee. As they sat at his kitchen table, Thomas unwrapped the red cloth to reveal a beautiful eagle feather decorated with small beads and leather strips. He placed it carefully on the table between them. "This feather belonged to my grandfather," Thomas explained. "He saw a white buffalo once, many years ago, when he was a young man. That sighting brought great changes to our people, good changes that saved us during a very hard winter. When I heard that you helped the white buffalo and its herd pass safely through your land, I knew I had to come and honor your actions." Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I just cut a fence," he said. "It wasn't anything special." Thomas smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "You showed respect for the sacred. You chose to help instead of harm. In our tradition, this is everything. My grandfather taught me that the white buffalo appears when the earth needs healing, when people need to remember their connection to all living things." Over the next hour, Thomas shared stories that Jake's grandfather had never told him. He learned that the white buffalo was believed to be a messenger, appearing at times when important decisions needed to be made. Those who showed respect and kindness to the sacred animal would receive help when they needed it most. "The white buffalo remembers," Thomas said as he prepared to leave. "It remembers kindness, and it remembers those who understand the sacred nature of all life. Your grandfather would be proud of what you did." After Thomas left, Jake found himself thinking about their conversation throughout the day. The elder had given him the decorated feather as a gift, saying it would bring protection and good fortune. Jake wasn't sure he believed in such things, but he hung the feather above his fireplace anyway, out of respect for Thomas and the old traditions. The financial pressures on the ranch hadn't disappeared. If anything, they'd gotten worse. The bank had called twice, reminding Jake about the overdue mortgage payments. His neighbor, Carl Morrison, had stopped by to make another offer to buy the ranch, this time for even less money than before. Carl owned the largest cattle operation in the county and had been trying to acquire Jake's land for years. "Jake, be practical," Carl had said, standing in Jake's kitchen with his expensive hat in his hands. "This drought has hurt everyone, but you're in deeper trouble than most. Sell to me now, and you'll have enough money to start over somewhere else. Wait much longer, and the bank will just take it anyway." Jake had politely declined, but Carl's words haunted him. The practical part of his mind knew that his neighbor was probably right. The ranch was failing, and Jake didn't have the capital to turn things around. Selling might be the smart choice. But every time he considered giving up, he thought about the white buffalo and the promise in its eyes. Something told him to hold on, to fight for the land a little longer. 2 days after Thomas's visit, Jake discovered he wasn't the only one who felt this way. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist from the university, arrived with a small team to study the area where the buffalo herd had been seen. Sarah was a woman in her early 40s with short brown hair and intelligent green eyes. She wore practical field clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone who spent more time outdoors than in an office. "Mr. Winters," she said as Jake met her team at his gate, "we're conducting a study on buffalo migration patterns and the impact of preserved grassland on wildlife populations. We heard that you had a significant buffalo sighting on your property recently." Jake confirmed the sighting, but didn't mention the white buffalo specifically. Something made him want to keep that detail private, at least for now. Sarah and her team spent several days documenting the grazing patterns, water sources, and plant life on Jake's ranch. What they discovered surprised everyone. "This is remarkable," Sarah told Jake as her team prepared to leave. "Your grazing management has created one of the healthiest prairie ecosystems we've documented in this region. The way you've rotated your cattle and managed your water sources has actually improved the native grassland rather than degrading it." Jake was confused. "I just do what my father and grandfather taught me. I didn't think it was anything special." Sarah shook her head. "What you've been doing is actually a form of regenerative agriculture that most ranchers don't understand. You've been working with the natural systems instead of against them. This land could be a model for sustainable ranching practices throughout the region. Before she left, Sarah gave Jake her business card and made an unexpected offer. There are federal grants available for ranchers who want to implement conservation practices that benefit wildlife. What you're already doing would qualify for significant funding. I'd like to help you apply if you're interested. That evening, Jake sat on his porch with Sarah's business card in his hand, thinking about what she had said. His grandfather had taught him to pay attention to the land, to watch how the grass grew and where the water flowed. Jake had always assumed this was just common sense, but apparently it was something more valuable. The next morning brought another surprise visitor. Maria Gonzalez, a reporter from the regional newspaper, had driven out to interview Jake about the buffalo sighting. Word was spreading beyond the local community, and people were becoming curious about the white buffalo. Maria was a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and bright, curious eyes. She carried a small recording device and a notebook, and she asked intelligent questions about the buffalo herd and Jake's decision to help them pass through his property. Some people were saying this was just a normal albino buffalo, Maria said. Others claim it was spiritually significant. What do you think? Jake chose his words carefully. I think it was a beautiful animal that deserved respect. Whether it was spiritual or not isn't for me to say, but seeing it reminded me of something important about why this land matters. Maria's article, published 3 days later, struck a chord with readers throughout Montana and beyond. She had written about the white buffalo, the sacred traditions of Native American peoples, and the importance of preserving wild spaces for future generations. More importantly, she had captured the story of a rancher who chose kindness over profit, respect over fear. The response to the article was overwhelming. Jake's phone began ringing with calls from people who wanted to visit the site where the white buffalo had been seen. Some were curious tourists, others were spiritual seekers hoping to experience something sacred. A few were investors interested in developing the land for tourism. Among the callers was Robert Sterling, a wealthy businessman from California who specialized in ecotourism ventures. Sterling offered to buy Jake's ranch for 3 times what Carl Morrison had proposed, with plans to turn it into a spiritual retreat center focused on Native American traditions and wildlife observation. Think about it, Mr. Winters, Sterling had said during their phone conversation. You could be part of something much larger than cattle ranching. This could be a place where people come to reconnect with nature and understand the importance of conservation. The offer was tempting, especially given Jake's financial situation. 3 times Carl's offer would not only pay off the mortgage, but leave Jake with enough money to buy a smaller place and live comfortably for the rest of his life. It seemed like the answer to all his problems. But Jake found himself hesitating. Something about Sterling's plans didn't feel right. The idea of turning his family's ranch into a tourist attraction, even one focused on conservation, bothered him in ways he couldn't fully explain. That weekend, Thomas Crow Feather returned, this time accompanied by several other tribal elders. They had come to perform a ceremony to honor the white buffalo and to bless the land where it had appeared. Jake felt honored that they would include his ranch in their spiritual practices. The ceremony took place at sunset near the creek where Jake had first seen the buffalo herd. The elders formed a circle, offering prayers in their native language and burning sage that filled the air with its clean, sharp scent. They sang ancient songs that seemed to harmonize with the evening wind across the prairie. During the ceremony, Jake felt the same sense of connection he had experienced when he first saw the white buffalo. The land felt alive around him, filled with a presence that went beyond what could be seen or touched. This was what his grandfather had tried to teach him all those years ago, that the prairie was more than dirt and grass, more than property to be bought and sold. After the ceremony, the elders shared a meal with Jake on his porch. As they ate and talked, Thomas asked about the offers Jake had been receiving to sell his land. The white buffalo brought attention to this place, Thomas said thoughtfully, but attention can be both a blessing and a curse. You must be careful not to let others use the sacred for their own purposes. One of the other elders, a woman named Mary Little Hawk, nodded in agreement. The earth does not belong to us, she said. We belong to the earth. When we forget this, we lose our way. Their words stayed with Jake long after the elders had gone home. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the wind through his open window, he thought about the choices he faced. Sterling's offer could solve his financial problems, but it would also mean losing control of the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The federal grants that Dr. Mitchell had mentioned might provide another path forward, but they would require changes to how he managed the ranch. Some of his neighbors might not understand or approve of working with the government on conservation projects. Carl Morrison's offer was the safest option in many ways, but it would mean watching his family's legacy disappear into a larger cattle operation that might not respect the land's unique character. As Jake drifted off to sleep, he found himself thinking about the white buffalo's eyes, dark and wise and filled with an intelligence that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. Tomorrow he would have to start making some difficult decisions, but tonight he felt strangely peaceful. The sacred animal had indeed brought change, just as the old stories promised. Now Jake had to figure out how to honor that change while staying true to the land and the legacy his family had entrusted to him. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as Jake walked the fence line on a gray October morning, 6 months after his first encounter with a white buffalo. The landscape had changed dramatically since then, not just with the season but with the weight of decisions made and paths chosen. Golden aspen leaves danced in the wind, creating a rustling symphony that had always been one of Jake's favorite sounds. His choice had been difficult, but in the end, he had decided to work with Dr. Sarah Mitchell on the federal conservation grants rather than sell the ranch. The application process had been complicated, requiring detailed environmental assessments, management plans, and documentation of the ranch's ecological value. But the effort had paid off. 3 weeks ago, Jake had received notification that his ranch had been approved for a substantial conservation grant that would allow him to pay off the mortgage and implement sustainable practices that would benefit both his cattle operation and the local wildlife. The transformation had already begun. New water systems had been installed to create seasonal wetlands that would attract migrating birds. Native grasses were being reseeded in areas that had been overgrazed. Most importantly, Jake had learned to see his land through different eyes, not just as a place to raise cattle, but as a complex ecosystem where every element played a vital role. Thomas Crow Feather had become a regular visitor, serving as an unofficial cultural advisor for the project. The elderly Blackfeet leader had suggested incorporating traditional land management techniques that his people had used for centuries. These methods, combined with modern conservation science, were creating results that surprised even Dr. Mitchell. "Your grandfather would be amazed," Thomas had told Jake just last week as they watched a family of deer drinking from one of the new wetland areas. "The land is healing itself, just like the old stories said it would." But Jake's newfound success had created unexpected complications. News of the conservation project and its connection to the sacred white buffalo had spread far beyond Montana. Pilgrims seeking spiritual experiences began arriving without permission, camping on Jake's property, and leaving behind trash and damage. Some claimed they were following visions or dreams that had led them to the sacred site. More troubling were the protesters who had started gathering near the main road that led to Jake's ranch. Led by a local rancher named Pete Hawkins, they carried signs reading "Stop Government Land Grabs" and "Ranchers' Rights Matter." Pete had been spreading rumors that Jake's conservation project was just the first step in a federal plan to seize private ranch land throughout the region. "You're setting a dangerous precedent, Jake." Pete had confronted him at the feed store in town just 2 days earlier. "First it's conservation grants, then it's regulations, then it's the government telling us we can't run cattle at all. You're selling out every rancher in the county." Jake had tried to explain that the grants actually supported ranching while protecting wildlife habitat, but Pete wasn't interested in listening. The confrontation had ended with harsh words and several other ranchers taking sides, dividing the small community. The stress of dealing with these controversies was taking its toll on Jake's health. He had lost weight and wasn't sleeping well. Some mornings he wondered if he should have just sold the ranch to Carl Morrison and avoided all the complications that came with trying to do something different. It was during one of these difficult mornings that Jake received an unexpected phone call. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a wildlife veterinarian from the State University, was calling about an emergency at the national preserve that bordered Jake's ranch. "Mr. Winters, Dr." Vasquez said, her voice tense with urgency. "We have a situation that requires your help. A disease outbreak has hit the buffalo herd in the preserve. We've lost 12 animals so far, and we're trying to prevent it from spreading to the entire population." Jake's heart sank. "What kind of disease?" "Bacterial pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition from the drought conditions last summer." The herd is weakened and vulnerable. We need to establish quarantine areas and provide supplemental feeding, but we don't have enough space within the preserve boundaries. We're hoping you might allow us to use part of your ranch as a temporary treatment facility." Without hesitation, Jake agreed to help. Within hours, veterinary teams and wildlife officials were setting up a field hospital in one of his pastures. Portable fencing created isolation pens for sick buffalo, while healthy animals were moved to a separate area for monitoring and preventive treatment. Jake threw himself into the rescue effort, working alongside the veterinarians and wildlife biologists around the clock. He helped carry medicine, assisted with feeding the weakened animals, and used his knowledge of the local terrain to guide the teams to the best locations for the temporary facilities. On the third day of the operation, Dr. Vasquez approached Jake with news that made his blood run cold. "We found the white buffalo," she said quietly. "It's sick too, but it's refusing to come near our treatment areas. It's staying about half a mile away, near the creek on the eastern edge of your property." Jake grabbed his binoculars and followed Dr. Vasquez to where the white buffalo had been spotted. Through the lenses, he could see the magnificent animal standing alone beside the creek. Even from a distance, it was clear that something was wrong. The buffalo's head hung low, and its breathing appeared labored. Its pure white coat, which had gleamed like snow 6 months earlier, now looked dull and lifeless. "We've tried to approach it several times," Dr. Vasquez explained, "but it moves away whenever we get close. It's almost like it doesn't trust humans, except what?" One of the preserve rangers mentioned that this particular buffalo seemed comfortable around your property before. "There's a chance it might trust you enough to let us help it." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. The white buffalo that had changed his life was now sick and possibly dying, and he might be the only person who could help save it. That evening, Jake sat on his porch planning his approach. Thomas Crow Feather had driven over as soon as he heard about the sick buffalo, bringing with him several other tribal elders. They performed purification ceremonies and prepared traditional medicines that might help supplement the veterinary treatment. "The white buffalo is testing you," Thomas said as they prepared to make their approach the next morning. "It showed you kindness when you needed guidance. Now you must show kindness when it needs help." At dawn, Jake walked slowly across his pasture toward the creek where the white buffalo waited. He carried a bucket of grain mixed with antibiotics that Dr. Vasquez had prepared, moving carefully to avoid startling the sick animal. Behind him, at a respectful distance, the veterinary team followed with tranquilizer equipment and portable treatment supplies. As Jake approached, the white buffalo lifted its massive head and looked at him with eyes that were clouded with fever, but still held that familiar intelligence. The animal didn't move away as Jake had feared. Instead, it seemed to recognize him, remembering their encounter 6 months earlier when Jake had cut the fence to let the herd pass safely. "Easy, old friend," Jake whispered, setting down the bucket of medicated grain about 10 feet away from the buffalo. "I know you don't feel good, but we want to help you." The white buffalo studied Jake for a long moment, then slowly approached the bucket. As it began to eat, Jake gradually moved closer, speaking in soft, reassuring tones. The animal allowed him to come within arm's reach, close enough to see the fever in its eyes and feel the labored rhythm of its breathing. Dr. Vasquez and her team moving carefully, following Jake's lead. With infinite patience, they were able to examine the white buffalo and administer the treatments it needed. The animal remained calm throughout the process, as if it understood that these humans were trying to help rather than harm. The treatment took several hours. The white buffalo received antibiotics, fluids, and nutritional supplements to help its body fight the infection. Throughout the process, Jake stayed close, offering comfort and reassurance to the magnificent creature that had brought so much change to his life. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the white buffalo finally lay down to rest in the shade of the cottonwood trees near the creek. Dr. Vasquez pronounced the initial treatment successful, but warned that recovery would take time and continued care. "We'll need to monitor it closely for the next several days," she told Jake. "It seems to trust you more than anyone else. Would you be willing to help with the ongoing treatment?" Jake agreed without hesitation. Over the following weeks, he spent hours each day caring for the white buffalo, administering medicines, providing fresh water, and simply sitting nearby to offer companionship during the long recovery process. The animal seemed to appreciate his presence, often resting its great head near Jake as he read or worked on ranch paperwork. The story of Jake's dedication to nursing the sacred white buffalo back to health spread throughout the region and beyond. News crews arrived to document the recovery process, and the earlier protests against the conservation project gradually faded as people saw the positive results of Jake's efforts. Carl Morrison, who had been one of Jake's harshest critics, arrived one morning to see the white buffalo for himself. He found Jake sitting beside the recovering animal, feeding it fresh grass by hand. "I owe you an apology," Carl said quietly. "I thought you were making a mistake with all this conservation stuff. But seeing this, well, it makes a man think about what really matters." Even Pete Hawkins, the leader of the protesters, eventually came to visit. He didn't offer any apologies, but he spent a long time watching the white buffalo and asking Jake thoughtful questions about the conservation project. "Maybe there's room for different ways of ranching," Pete admitted as he prepared to leave. "I still don't agree with everything you're doing, but I respect that you're trying to do right by the land." As autumn deepened into winter, the white buffalo's health steadily improved. Its coat regained its brilliant white sheen, and its eyes cleared of the fever that had nearly claimed its life. Other buffalo from the herd began visiting, as if checking on their leader's recovery. One crisp November morning, Jake arrived at the creek to find the white buffalo standing strong and healthy, surrounded by its herd. The magnificent animal looked at Jake with clear, bright eyes that seemed to hold a message of gratitude and farewell. Throughout that day, Jake watched as the herd prepared to move deeper into the preserve for the winter. The white buffalo approached him one final time, close enough that Jake could feel the warmth of its breath in the cold air. For a moment, they stood together in perfect silence, two beings who had found their lives unexpectedly intertwined. Then, with the same dignity Jake remembered from their first meeting, the white buffalo turned and led its herd away toward the winter pastures. As they disappeared into the distance, Jake felt a deep sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed. The crisis had passed, and the sacred animal was healed. But Jake knew that the greatest healing had happened within himself, and within the land that he had learned to see with new eyes. 2 years had passed since the white buffalo's recovery, and Jake's ranch had become something he never could have imagined. The conservation project had grown into a model program that attracted visitors from around the world. Scientists, ranchers, environmental groups, and indigenous leaders all came to see how traditional wisdom and modern conservation could work together. The spring morning was perfect as Jake walked through his transformed property. The wetlands he had created were alive with the sound of returning waterfowl. Red-winged blackbirds called from the cattails, while great blue herons stood motionless in the shallow water, waiting for unwary fish. The native grass restoration had been so successful that some areas looked exactly like the prairie his grandfather had described from his childhood. But success had brought new challenges that Jake never anticipated. The attention from his conservation work had attracted the interest of a major development corporation called Pinnacle Resources. They wanted to lease mineral rights on his land for natural gas extraction, offering an amount of money that would set Jake up for life and fund conservation projects throughout the region. The offer had arrived 3 months ago in the form of a visit from Patricia Chun, Pinnacle's chief negotiator. She was a sharp, professional woman in her 40s who dressed in expensive suits and spoke in precise, measured sentences. Her proposal was tempting and well-researched. "Mr. Winters," Patricia had explained during their initial meeting, "modern extraction techniques can access the natural gas deposits beneath your property with minimal surface impact. We're talking about perhaps a dozen small well sites connected by underground pipelines. The surface area affected would be less than 5% of your total acreage." The financial terms were staggering. Pinnacle offered a signing bonus of $500,000, plus royalty payments that could reach 6 figures annually for decades. They had even agreed to fund additional conservation projects on the remaining 95% of the ranch. Jake had asked for time to consider the offer, but the decision was tearing him apart. The money would solve every financial concern he might ever have, and Pinnacle's environmental impact studies suggested the drilling would be minimally disruptive. Some of his neighbors who had signed similar deals were making more money from gas royalties than from cattle ranching. Yet something felt wrong about the proposal. Despite Pinnacle's assurances, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that industrial development, no matter how carefully managed, would fundamentally change the character of the land. The sacred quality that had drawn the white buffalo, the spiritual significance that had brought Native American elders to perform ceremonies here, might be lost forever. Thomas Crow Feather had become increasingly concerned as word of the development proposal spread through the tribal community. The elderly Blackfeet leader visited Jake more frequently, often bringing other tribal members who wanted to express their views about protecting the sacred site. The white buffalo chose this place for healing, Thomas had said during one of these visits. If you allow machines to dig deep into the earth here, that sacred energy will be wounded. Some wounds cannot be healed, even with time. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had become both a colleague and a friend through their conservation work, was equally troubled by the development proposal. She had conducted additional wildlife studies that showed the ranch had become a crucial habitat corridor connecting the national preserve to other protected areas. Jake, what you've created here is irreplaceable, Sarah had argued during heated discussion in his kitchen. The wildlife populations have recovered beyond our best projections. We're seeing species return that haven't been documented in this region for decades. Industrial development would destroy that progress. But Jake's neighbor Carl Morrison saw things differently. Carl had signed a deal with Pinnacle 6 months earlier and was already receiving substantial royalty payments. He had become an advocate for the development project, arguing that the economic benefits outweighed the environmental concerns. Jake, you're being stubborn, Carl had said during a recent conversation. This gas development is going to happen throughout the region, whether you participate or not. At least with Pinnacle, you can control how it's done on your land and use the money for conservation. The pressure was coming from all directions. Environmental groups were urging Jake to refuse the development deal and preserve the ranch as a wildlife sanctuary. Local business leaders were pushing him to accept the offer and bring new economic activity to the struggling rural community. The tribal council was preparing a formal resolution asking him to reject any industrial development on the sacred site. Meanwhile, Patricia Chan was applying her own form of pressure through regular visits and increasingly attractive terms. Pinnacle had sweetened their original offer twice, and Patricia hinted that the company might be willing to negotiate even more favorable terms if Jake would commit soon. Time is a factor, Mr. Winters, Patricia had warned during her most recent visit. Natural gas prices are favorable now, but market conditions change. This opportunity might not be available indefinitely. Jake found himself unable to sleep, spending long nights walking his property and wrestling with the decision. He felt the weight of responsibility not just for his own future, but for the land itself and all the lives it touched. The wrong choice could affect not only wildlife and environmental systems, but also the spiritual beliefs of people who consider this place sacred. It was during one of these sleepless walks that Jake made a discovery that changed everything. He was following the creek toward the eastern boundary of his property when he noticed something unusual near the old buffalo crossing. Fresh hoof prints in the mud showed that buffalo had been visiting his land again, something that hadn't happened since the white buffalo's recovery 2 years earlier. Jake followed the tracks deeper onto his property, using his flashlight to stay on the trail in the pre-dawn darkness. The prints led to a grove of ancient cottonwood trees near the center of his ranch, a place that had always felt special to him, but which he rarely visited except during cattle roundups. In the gray light of dawn, Jake saw them. The white buffalo had returned, accompanied by what appeared to be the same herd from his original encounter. But this time there was something new. The white buffalo was not alone. Beside it stood a smaller buffalo with a coat that was not pure white, but a pale cream color marked with patches of brown. Jake realized he was looking at the white buffalo's offspring, born in the wild and now old enough to travel with the herd. The sight took his breath away. The sacred animal that had changed his life had brought its calf to the place where it had once been healed, perhaps seeking the same safety and protection for its young. The white buffalo looked directly at Jake, and once again he felt that sense of communication that went beyond words. The animal's eyes held the same intelligence and wisdom he remembered, but now there was something else, a trust that had been earned through shared experience and mutual respect. As Jake watched the herd graze peacefully among the cottonwood trees, he realized that his decision about the development proposal had just been made for him. This land was more than property or assets or economic opportunity. It was a sanctuary, a place where the sacred and the natural world could coexist in harmony. The buffalo had returned to show him what he already knew in his heart. Some things were too valuable to risk, no matter what the financial incentive might be. That morning, Jay called Patricia Chun and informed her that he was declining Pinnacle's offer. She was professional, but clearly disappointed, warning him that the company might not be interested in future negotiations if he changed his mind. The decision immediately created ripples throughout the community. Carl Morrison was furious, accusing Jake of being selfish and short-sighted. Some local business leaders worried that Jake's rejection of the development deal would discourage other energy companies from investing in the region. But there was also significant support for Jake's choice. The tribal council issued a statement praising his decision to protect the sacred site. Environmental groups celebrated the preservation of critical wildlife habitat. Dr. Sarah Mitchell immediately began working on proposals for additional conservation funding that would help offset the financial opportunity Jake had sacrificed. Thomas Crow Feather arrived that evening with a delegation of tribal elders to perform a ceremony honoring Jake's decision. As the sun set over the prairie, they formed a circle among the cottonwood trees where the white buffalo and its calf had been seen. The ceremony was more elaborate than any Jake had witnessed before, with traditional drums, ancient songs, and prayers offered in multiple native languages. "You have honored the sacred trust," Thomas told Jake as the ceremony concluded. "The white buffalo brought change to your life, and now you have completed the circle by protecting what it holds dear." As the elders packed their ceremonial items and prepared to leave, Thomas approached Jake privately. "There is something else," he said quietly. "The tribal council has been discussing a proposal that might interest you. We want to establish a formal partnership to create an indigenous cultural and educational center here on your ranch." Thomas explained that the center would bring visitors to learn about traditional ecological knowledge, Native American history, and the spiritual significance of the natural world. The project would provide steady income for the ranch while preserving its sacred character and advancing important educational goals. "It will be different from a gas development," Thomas said. "Instead of taking from the earth, we would be giving back, sharing knowledge and wisdom that could help heal the relationship between humans and the natural world." Jake was intrigued by the proposal, but asked for time to consider it carefully. He had learned to be cautious about projects that would change the character of his land, even ones that seemed aligned with his values. That night, he walked out to the cottonwood grove one more time. The buffalo had moved on during the day, returning to the deeper wilderness of the national preserve. But their presence lingered in the bent grass and the faint tracks near the creek. As Jake stood among the ancient trees, he felt a sense of peace that had been missing during the months of wrestling with the development decision. The white buffalo had returned to remind him of what truly mattered, and he had found the courage to choose preservation over profit. The future was still uncertain, and there would be new challenges to face. But Jake felt confident that he had made the right choice for the land, for the wildlife that depended on it, and for the sacred traditions that had been honored here for generations. The white buffalo had kept its promise, returning in his moment of greatest need to guide him toward the path of wisdom and protection. 5 years had passed since Jake first encountered the white buffalo, and the ranch had become something that surpassed even his grandfather's wildest dreams. The Indigenous Cultural and Educational Center, built in partnership with the Blackfeet Nation, had opened 3 years ago and was drawing thousands of visitors annually. The center was designed to blend seamlessly with the landscape, its low buildings constructed from local stone and timber, with rooftop gardens that attracted birds and provided traditional medicinal plants. Jake stood on the wooden deck of the center's main building, watching the morning sun illuminate the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. At 63, his hair had gone completely gray, and his face showed the deep lines of a man who had spent decades under the open sky. But his eyes held a contentment that had been absent during those difficult years when he had struggled to keep the ranch afloat. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention to the education pavilion, where a group of fourth graders from the nearby reservation school was participating in a traditional ecological knowledge program. Thomas Crow Feather, now in his late 70s but still spry and sharp-minded, was teaching them about the relationship between buffalo and prairie grass, using storytelling techniques that had been passed down through countless generations. "The buffalo and the grass are relatives," Thomas was explaining to the fascinated children. The buffalo eat the grass and move on, giving it time to rest and grow stronger. Their hooves break up the hard soil, so rain can reach the roots. Their waste feeds the earth. Everything is connected in the sacred circle of life. Jake smiled as he listened to the familiar lesson. The educational center had become Thomas's second home, and the elder had proven to be a gifted teacher who could communicate complex ecological concepts through traditional stories that children never forgot. Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached from the research station, carrying a tablet computer filled with data from the ongoing wildlife monitoring project. At 47, Sarah had been promoted to head of the university's conservation biology department, but she still spent several weeks each year at Jake's ranch conducting research and training graduate students. The results from this year's biodiversity survey are incredible, Sarah announced, her voice filled with excitement. We've documented 43 different bird species nesting on the ranch, including several that were considered locally extinct 20 years ago. The wetland restoration project alone has attracted 16 species of waterfowl. The success of the conservation efforts had exceeded everyone's expectations. The ranch had become a living laboratory where traditional indigenous knowledge was combined with cutting-edge conservation science. Graduate students from universities around the world came to study the innovative approaches being developed there. But Jake's thoughts were drawn to a more personal milestone that was approaching. Tomorrow marked exactly 5 years since he had first seen the white buffalo cross his property. Thomas had suggested that they hold a special ceremony to commemorate the anniversary, and representatives from several tribal nations were planning to attend. As if summoned by his thoughts, Jake's attention was caught by movement near the eastern fence line. He raised his binoculars and felt his heart skip a beat. The white buffalo was back, standing majestically near the creek where it had first entered his property 5 years ago. But this time it wasn't alone. Beside the magnificent white animal stood its offspring, now fully grown and bearing its own cream-colored coat marked with distinctive brown patterns. And next to them was an even smaller buffalo, a young calf with fur that appeared to be pure white, just like its grandmother. Jake called out to Thomas and Sarah, who quickly joined him on the deck. Thomas took one look through the binoculars and began speaking rapidly in his native language, words that Jake recognized as prayers of gratitude and amazement. 3 generations, Thomas whispered in English. The sacred bloodline continues. This is a sign of great blessing. Word of the white buffalo's return spread quickly through the center. Staff members, visitors, and the school children all gathered respectfully at a distance to witness the rare sight. The adults maintained the proper ceremonial protocols that Thomas had taught them, while the children watched in wide-eyed wonder at the magnificent creatures. Jake found himself thinking about all the changes that had occurred since that first encounter. The ranch was now financially stable, generating income from the educational center, research partnerships, and sustainable ecotourism. More importantly, it had become a model for how private land could be managed to benefit both conservation and community. The Indigenous Cultural Center had grown into more than just an educational facility. It had become a place where tribal members could reconnect with traditional practices, where non-Indigenous visitors could learn about Native American cultures with respect and authenticity, and where scientists could study the ecological wisdom that Indigenous peoples had developed over thousands of years. Jake's relationship with his neighbors had also transformed over the years. Carl Morrison, who had initially criticized Jake's conservation approach, had eventually become one of its strongest supporters. Carl had witnessed firsthand how the wildlife habitat improvements on Jake's land had benefited his own cattle operation by controlling pests and improving water quality. Even Pete Hawkins, the former protest leader, had gradually changed his perspective. His grandson had participated in several educational programs at the center and had developed such a passion for wildlife biology that he was now studying conservation science at the state university. As Jake watched the white buffalo family graze peacefully near the creek, he reflected on the unexpected ways that one moment of kindness could ripple out to touch countless lives. His decision to cut that fence 5 years ago had led to a series of events that had transformed not just his ranch, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the wildlife veterinarian who had helped save the white buffalo during its illness, had arrived that morning to participate in the anniversary celebration. She approached Jake with a gentle smile, remembering their shared experience during those tense days when the sacred animal's life had hung in the balance. You know, Elena said quietly, I've worked with wildlife for over 20 years, but I've never seen anything like what you've created here. This place has become something that exists at the intersection of science, spirituality, and practical conservation. It shouldn't work, but it does. That evening, as the sun began to set, the anniversary ceremony began. Representatives from 7 different tribal nations had gathered, along with scientists, conservation leaders, local ranchers, and community members. They formed a large circle among the cottonwood trees, where Jake had first seen the white buffalo with its calf 3 years earlier. Thomas Crow Feather led the ceremony, speaking about the significance of the white buffalo in indigenous traditions and the importance of the healing that had taken place on this land. He talked about how the sacred animal had brought together people from different backgrounds and beliefs, creating understanding and cooperation where there had once been division. The white buffalo teaches us that all life is connected, Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. When we harm the earth, we harm ourselves. When we heal the earth, we heal our spirits. Jake Winters understood this lesson and chose to honor the sacred. Because of his choice, this place has become a sanctuary for all beings. Jake was invited to speak, but he found himself struggling to find words that could capture everything he had learned over the past 5 years. Instead, he shared a simple story about his grandfather and the lessons he had tried to pass down about respecting the land and all its creatures. My grandfather used to tell me that we are not owners of the land, Jake said. We are caretakers, responsible for protecting it for the generations that come after us. The white buffalo reminded me of that responsibility and showed me that it's possible to do well by doing good. As the ceremony concluded, the participants shared a meal of traditional foods prepared by tribal members and local volunteers. The conversation flowed between English and several native languages, with children playing nearby and elders sharing stories that have been passed down through generations. Jake found himself sitting beside a young Blackfeet woman named Lisa Crow Dog, who was pursuing a doctorate in environmental science at Stanford University. She had grown up hearing Thomas's stories about the white buffalo and had come to the anniversary celebration to see the sacred site for herself. This place represents everything I hope to accomplish in my career, Lisa told Jake as they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. You've proven that conservation doesn't have to mean excluding people from a land. Instead, it can bring communities together around shared values and mutual respect. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Jake walked out to the fence line one more time. The white buffalo family was still visible in the moonlight, resting peacefully near the creek. The sight filled him with a deep sense of completion and gratitude. Thomas approached quietly and stood beside Jake in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, the elder spoke. The white buffalo brought you a gift 5 years ago, Thomas said softly. But the greatest gift was not what it gave you. It was what you gave in return. You chose to honor the sacred when it would have been easier to ignore it. You chose to heal rather than harm. You chose to build bridges instead of walls. Jake nodded, thinking about all the people whose lives have been touched by the choices made on this land. The children who had learned to see themselves as part of the natural world. The scientists who had discovered new ways to balance human needs with environmental protection. The community members who had learned to work together despite their differences. The white buffalo had indeed brought change, just as the old stories promised. But the change had not been magical or mystical. It had been the result of human choices, of people deciding to act with courage, compassion, and wisdom in the face of difficult challenges. As Jake walked back toward the house, he could hear the white buffalo calling softly to its family in the darkness. The sound was peaceful and content, like a lullaby sung under the stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, all was well in the sanctuary that had grown from a simple act of kindness toward a sacred creature. The white buffalo had returned the favor, bringing healing, prosperity, and purpose to the land and all who called it home. The circle was complete, but the story would continue as long as there were people willing to listen to the wisdom of the earth and act with respect for all living things.